Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third session of the North American Fruit Explorers Conference. I'm super excited to be here this afternoon as a facilitator of this session. And my name is Chris Heater. I am the president of NAFEX. I'm currently volunteering as president. And we've got a fantastic session on permaculture orchards in a changing climate for you today. But before we get started into that great content, we're going to go through a few housekeeping details. So first of all, this is a Zoom webinar, which is a little bit different than meetings, Zoom meetings that you might be familiar with. So you'll find that you're already muted and your video is off, and it will stay that way for the entire session. So you don't have to worry about that. You can ask questions. There's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And for those of you not that familiar with Zoom, use your little cursor and that will kind of unlock that bottom bar and you'll see Q&A, and that's where you can click and type in your questions. You're welcome to just put in general questions, or if you have a particular question you'd like to direct to a panelist, you could also make that comment if you would like. The other thing is that this is being recorded. So if you miss something or you want to go back and see it, within 24 to 48 hours, you'll be able to log into the NAFEX website using your email address, and you'll be able to access the content that way. All the videos will be there for a year, and then we're going to move them to a more public platform at the end of the year, at full calendar year. All right. So before we get into those panelists, just a couple things about NAFEX. I know we have a lot of new people who just joined us for this conference, actually over 250 people. And so I just want to give you a little bit of background. So NAFEX began in the 1960s, around 1967, but there was some lead up to that before NAFEX really became a group by this name. And I'm going to go through that tomorrow at 3 p.m. at our annual meeting. We're going to do a little historical review of NAFEX and have some fun chats with a couple of our members. So you can learn a little bit more about NAFEX there. But it was designed to be an organization where people could share information and learn from each other about fruit, whether it's fruit exploring or fruit growing or even breeding. And so over the years, this has really evolved in many ways. We have a quarterly that is published. It's both available online and as a printed content that goes to all of our members. And then we also have interest groups where people can really drill down and focus on a particular fruit or aspect of growing fruit. And then we've recently implemented some new online tools that I'll go through tomorrow, which include regional help options on our website. So tune in tomorrow at 3 p.m. to learn a lot more about NAFEX and all that we're offering and what we expect to be doing in the next year, which I'm really thrilled. We've got a great board of directors and there's so much going on. So tune in tomorrow, you'll learn more. And if you missed that, you can also catch the recording later. All right. So also tomorrow will be our annual meeting, which will be short and sweet. I am not a meeting person, so I like to keep these things really quick. But we will go over some really important business things tomorrow at that meeting as well. All right, so let's get started because I know this is what you're here for. You want to hear from these three great panelists. And the way this works is we're going to go in order. All panelists will speak and then we'll open it up for the Q&A after that. So even if you have a question for the first panelist, we won't get to that till the end. All right. So let me introduce our first panelist, Keith Johnson. And Keith is somebody I actually met here in Indiana when he lived here. In fact, I had no idea what permaculture was, and it was because of Keith that I now know and actually practice permaculture. I was privileged to go through a tour of his place. He and Peter had a place here in Bloomington, and the amount of things that they were doing and growing on their small homestead, I call it a homestead because it's what it is, was phenomenal. Keith and Peter eventually moved. They moved in 2014 to Michigan. So Indiana's loss is Michigan's gain. And with that move, they encountered some very different growing conditions. So obviously a different temperature issues, and the soil was much different. So now they are dealing with sandy soils, whereas down here we have heavier clay soils. So this has been a learning experience for them. And the beauty of this is Peter and Keith have been doing this for years. They have been designing and landscaping and doing permaculture for well over 20 years. And Keith does a lot of consulting. He does a lot of speaking. He does permaculture design courses. I took a course with him and Peter and Rhonda Baird, just a wealth of knowledge. So I really am excited that he's going to be speaking. He also serves as an editorial staff on the Permaculture Activist magazine, and he and Peter can be followed on the permacultureactivist.net website. I'll also talk about a few things that he has made available to us after this is all done. So with that, Keith, I'm going to turn this over to you. He's with Heartbeat Farm and the Permaculture Center. Take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Just a note, it's no longer Permaculture Activist. It's now Permaculture Design Magazine, the new owner and publisher, and permaculturedesignmagazine.com. Anyway, let's get this slideshow started here. I'm going to be talking about permaculture as or polyculture orchards for a changing climate. And the point I'd like to make here is this is not new. It's been around for a while. We're just recreating it now for the modern age. And the unfortunate thing there, we don't have a lot of detailed documentation from those times in Europe. Mostly it was just called farming. There was nothing much to distinguish it, except that people were doing all kinds of things in all kinds of ecosystems, from woodlands to prairies to wetlands. They were using them in all kinds of ways. So forest gardens in southern India are just simply known as home gardens. They have everything. They have a whole structure or complexity of planting, from trees to everything to small herbs. So even the Native Americans of this continent were also managers of ecosystems. I wish we had the recorded data from those practices. It would be life transforming, I'm certain. Anyway, let's move along. This in Spain was known as the Dehesa, or in Portuguese, Montado systems, and they had been around since a long time, 1,000+ years. They covered millions of acres, and it was based on a cork oak savanna system. The trees provided the acorn with shades for pigs and other animals, grazing animals, and the livestock provided fertilizer for all of the landscape. We've duplicated this to some extent on our own system using ducks and geese and chickens so far. We'll evolve to larger animals soon. So they provided a lot of habitat because they did provide a wide range of ecosystems for animals to thrive.
Hey, Keith,
But yes?
I'm going to interrupt just a second.
Please do.
You try sharing your screen? I think we're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, okay. All right, then. How's it working?
Oh, there we go.
All right. Okay.
And then I think
sorry. We can go back to the first screen here.
There we go. Great.
Is that what you want?
Yep.
All right. Very good. I'm glad to see that the panel pictures appear on top of my slides. Yay. Anyway, this is what I was talking about. You see, in this case, we have pigs, but many other grazing animals were used, sheep and so forth. So the unique feature of these systems is that they're marvelous at sequestering carbon. Agroforestry systems were listed in the top 17, 4 of the top 17 in the Project Drawdown's research project. They were thinking about 2 tons of carbon per acre per year, with managed grazing happening underneath them, also producing additional multi-tonnage of carbon. Now, the note is these systems don't keep sequestering indefinitely and become saturated after a number of decades. But anyway, it's a very powerful way to deal with our carbon problems and get it back into the earth. So These kinds of systems can yield many, many products, far more than just a simple monocrop system, including all these that you see here and here, including some rare items, unusual fruits, which I'm sure a lot of the NAFEX folks will know a lot about. So anyway, samples. These agroforestry practices, we can put them into some of the categories that we use in permaculture design. We speak of zones in permaculture, zones 0 through 5, zone 0 being the home and zone 5 being wilderness or wild places, and everything in between. So this is not the USDA zones. So alley cropping, for example, could happen in zones 2 to 4. 2 is just, 100 feet out beyond the house or so. And zone 4 is several hundreds of feet away, and so on. Silvopasture would be zones 3 to 4. Forest farming is more zone 4 to 5. Forest farming, usually we think of growing things like medicinal shade-loving plants and mushrooms and so on. Riparian buffers are another kind of planting that protects streams and drainages. We can consider those mostly in zones 4 or 5 of our permaculture systems. Windbreaks, another feature of agroforestry. All of these can produce crops as well as fodder, as well as many other yields, as we've seen in previous slides. So on. Let's move along. By the way, the USDA provides these pictures in documents that are produced with our taxes and are wonderful resources. Forest farming was another technique used by the Japanese, which was practiced on fairly steep landscapes. Now, in permaculture, we tend to say avoid those above 12 degrees of slope or incline. But these traditional farmers would be using quite a broad range of that landscape. In working with animals, and 40% of their income came from shiitake and 30% from cattle, most of which got their fodder from trees and the grasses that filled in the gaps created by occasional small clear cuts. And of course, everything was used. Now, these have been around since the 1200s. So it's been tested. But again, I wish we had more data about these systems. They're being reclaimed and rediscovered. Silvopasture is the practice of using animals amidst useful trees and polyculture of trees. So we have trees in pasture in terms of like A's in rows. We call this alley cropping. We could as well be, instead of cows or in rotation with animals or grazers, we producing annual crops in those same spaces between the trees. We can put livestock into the forest as well to help manage the forest, create new kinds of conditions for more animals to thrive, such as pigs, which can actually do a fine job. And of course, the animals have far less stress because of the shade during the hot times of the year, as well as the windbreak effects to protect them from cold winds in cold times. And then we have windbreaks, of course, what was incredibly important for us to know about here in Michigan, because we were impressed immediately by the intensity and continuity of winds. And it became very clear that windbreaks were going to make a big difference to our success here, because the sand soil, and I shouldn't even say sandy, it's sand. It's like sand dunes with lake water 20 feet below. Anyway, challenging situation. Windbreaks were necessary. We can use them to create living barns to encircle the cattle to make protected spaces. They provide shade and visual odor, sound barriers, and produce fodder. Many trees can be used for fodder, and we'll be talking about that a little later. All right, moving right along. We can talk about plant guilds. We're trying to create polyculture systems where plants produce and serve each other. So we have the crop plant with some of its guild. We have plants that attract pollinators. We have plants that either repel or attract other insects as predators or to discourage pests. We have plants that accumulate nitrogen for ground covers that act as a weed barrier that may be medicinal, that reduce soil compaction. And the tree or crop plant may serve as a trellis or a structural support. So we're looking for guilds that serve many functions, and we're in a specialized niche around a primary plant. So here we see some complex forest garden polyculture ecosystem that Jerome Osentowski's place at the Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute in Basalt, Colorado, about 7,000 plus feet. So it's bitterly cold, a short growing season, but he produces bananas and figs and citrus and so many other wonderful things in these greenhouses, as well as produces many crops for a nursery market. It's a total edible ecosystem that holds and contains the limited water that moves through the space. It produces many, many yields, including trained people who go there to learn permaculture and polyculture systems. So we have a lot of F words: food, fuel, fiber, fodder, fertilizer, flowers, fungi, pharmaceuticals, and a lot of fun if you're doing it right. So moving along, don't want to keep you. Okay, these are examples of our hedges here at our place in Michigan, and you see on the right a list of some of the components of those hedges. This is a 4-row hedge with 10-foot space between each one, with the tallest trees in the middle, 2 and the shorter trees on the edges, so as we create more of a profile to the northern and northwestern winds and western winds that will help break it up and pass over and through the break without causing a lot of disturbance or turbulence. Plus, it's, if we have fragrant things, we've got food happening in here, we've got legumes, so many things. If people have questions about any of these species, I don't have time to go into the detail they deserve, but let us move along. Let me check the time here. Chris, by the way, if you could give me a 5 or 10 minute warning before I move along, or before the session ends, I'd be grateful. Yes. Here you see our system. Because we have sand, and rain hits it and plunges into the earth and doesn't stay near the surface because of the very, very less than 1% organic matter content. Our challenge is to keep the top part of the surface moist. The more roots we can grow in it, the more water holding capacity we have, because there's more carbon in the soil. So we're emphasizing a production of biomass of every kind that we can possibly grow. And to make sure our fruit trees survive, you can see this tote water tank holding system with drip lines, wherein we fill the tanks and drain them immediately. We do not hold water in the tanks to prevent the growth of algae, which clogs the system and all the emitters. Something very important to know. So we can also, if we're inclined, put nutrients in that water, such as liquid seaweed or other liquid fertilizers. We also spray our trees with liquid fertilizers, manure teas, herbal teas. We make and put it into all of our system, charcoal, biochar, and as well as putting foliar seed sprays and protectants such as Surround, a clay product, which helps protect the trees from sun scald and pests. So it's all good. Some of our helpers and fertilizers that are making a tremendous difference in the system are the chickens and tractors you see on the left that move through the rows in the hedgerows as well as through the orchard. The ducks and the geese are also moved through the orchards with movable fencing. They do a great job of fertilizing everything pretty evenly, and they keep the grass down, so they're great weeders. We like them a lot, and we're enjoying their eggs a lot as well. We have two long rows of these in a wider stretch above the leach field for the septic system. And we chop and drop these two lovely items that are leguminous nitrogen fixtures. The one on the left is Desmanthus illinoinensis, or bundle flower. You can see it's a little puffy white flowers reminiscent of larger trees in the legume family. And on the right is senna. Produces a lot of beautiful flowers, and the bees love the flowers on both, and they're both chopped and dropped and with fruit trees on either side of this large patch. Everybody gets some nitrogen benefits from them. Here's an example of a coppiced alley crop of mulberry and hay, but you could raise many other things in between the mulberries. The mulberries are cut on a regular basis for fodder because mulberry is a tremendous fodder. Goats will eat it up in a big way. Cows will eat it as well as even horses. I'm certain that the dried leaf could be used in the food of almost any animal. I actually go to the health food store and get a product made from mulberry leaves called chlorophyll, liquid chlorophyll. I imagine it's also a source of magnesium because that's what chlorophyll molecule is at its center. I've mentioned coppice. Coppice is a very ancient practice, been around for at least hundreds and if not thousands of years, and been practiced mostly in Europe, and their remaining stands still in England. Whereas in this case it was beech, but a number of other species were used, and it was raised to a point where it was then cut hard to a stump and harvested at varying schedules depending on the size of the wood needed for whatever particular product was being used, whether firewood or furniture or pole wood or you name it. There are many charcoal, many products from these systems. Here's a very, very old coppice stump. And now these things lived much longer than that same species would, left to its own devices, as much as 2 to 3 times longer lifespan.
Keith, you got about 5 minutes.
Okay, moving right along. So we see many products. Here's just a few of them. Charcoal on the left, furniture, firewood, short rotation willow could be used in wetlands and can also be used for many other products. Here's the guy to go to, Ben Law in the UK. He knows all about this material. It's the practice of hedging using similar materials is also a tradition that's coming back to life again. Here we see some examples of how that's done and some of the species that are used for that purpose. By the way, the slides is available so you can get it what you missed. Put lots of flowers in the orchard. And finally, get the organisms happening in your orchard. That means feeding them after they've been implanted on their roots, and mostly fungi that you want to support in the orchard by putting woody mulches all around your fruit trees to support these complex systems. A tree connected to other trees and other organisms and other food sources, be a web of fungal mycelia, is one of the best things you could possibly want to have in your orchard. Plus, it makes them more climate resistant. I think we're coming to a close, so let me wrap it up. Oh, and just one final picture. Here we see apples pollard and pleached, which is we bind them together after you scrape off some cambium on each one until they grow together, and you give them a trellis to form the basic shape. Much more could be said about it, but that's about the end. So later, folks.
All right.
Stop share. There we go.
Thank you, Keith. That was fabulous. So as Keith mentioned, he has provided his PowerPoint slideshow, and that's going to be made available to you guys through a Google Drive, along with he has a PDF on the Spanish work that he talked about in the beginning of that. So many of our speakers are providing extra materials, and we will get you access to that after the conference. All right, so we're moving right along to our next speaker, and he can start getting his screen share going. Andrew Millison is from Oregon State University. He's been studying and teaching and practicing permaculture since he took his first PDC or permaculture design course in 1996. And then he started teaching it at the college level in 2001. He's been an instructor at Oregon State University in the horticulture department since 2009. And he first learned permaculture in the drylands, where he studied at Prescott College for his undergraduate and master's degree. In Arizona, his focus was on rainwater harvesting, gray water systems, and desert agriculture. He started a permaculture landscape design and building company, and also worked in an ecologically based landscape architecture firm. In recent years, he's focused more on design for climate change resilience, and that's one of the things that we heard from our members that they really want to hear about in learning how to really start taking care of and getting prepared for all these different climate things that are going on. So Andrew has been doing a lot of work and developing and planning. He's been involved with some permaculture housing developments, and he's also been involved in the Oregon water law for obtaining water rights. So with that, Andrew, I'm going to let you take it over, and we look forward to hearing from you.
All right. Thanks so much. I guess I'm unmuted here. Thanks so much. It's really nice to talk to you all. It was really great seeing Keith's place. I've got to say, I've actually been there in person and seen his lovely hedgerows and orchards, and it's a really fabulous place. So it was great hearing your talk, Keith. So I'm going to talk about climate resilience, and I'm not going to talk about specific methods of orchard production or anything like that. I'm going to talk about the context, the site context of how an orchard might be situated within the landscape that has advantageous elements around it and has advantageous relationships. And we're going to talk about we're talking about climate change, really, and we talk about permaculture, permanent agriculture. Permanent's kind of this funny word because you're like, what is permanent? I mean, the universe is expanding, right? And someday we'll all be stardust. So there's no real permanence with it. But in the scope of permanent and agriculture and climate change, we're talking about being resilient to extreme events. And I'm going to go through and show you some examples of some of the designs that people have created, the context for their orchards that are resilient to some of the extreme events that we see coming with climate change. We'll talk about drought. We'll talk about flood a little bit, about fires, and about extreme cold temperatures. So yeah, happy subjects there. So anyway, this picture here is one of the fathers of permaculture here. This is David Holmgren's property, and this is in Australia here. And so the orchard, you can find the orchard actually, the main part of the orchard's right here, one of them, but you can see that this orchard is surrounded by all of these supportive elements. We've got these water collecting ponds right here that are collecting the rainwater that falls here, right? Of course, we have this, you can see this passive solar house right here, and we have annual gardens that are wrapped around the house. This is that zone model that Keith was talking about. And then we have these supportive hedgerows and all of these other species around that create, well, for one thing, there's an ecology that's all around this orchard. So there's lots of flowering trees and plants and gardens that are providing all types of different ecosystem services for beneficial insects and material for mulch, right? And then of course, water for irrigation, and, you know, things like fencing. You could get materials for fencing for keeping out different browsing animals like deer. And so you can see that there's this whole human and natural ecosystem that is built around this orchard that can support it in many ways, right? So when we're talking about climate resilience, you know, I'm talking about, it's about context. Like, what is the context for your orchard that would allow it to survive some of the more extreme events? So for instance, you know, heat waves here, right? And, you know, hot drying winds, all this vegetation around here is going to serve as a windbreak, right? So, okay, let me clear my annotations and let's move on to the next slide here. Okay, so this is another site in Australia. And like I said, Australia is actually the place where permaculture was developed. And so there's lots of great examples here. And this is a place called Taranaki Farm. And it's a family farm that had been in the family for many generations. And then one of the younger folks got into permaculture and got into keyline planning, right? So keyline design. So this is a farm that is designed. So keyline design is like one of the influential design systems that permaculture, a lot of things in permaculture are based on. And so you can see that on this farm that there are orchard blocks, right? And that are planted here around the area. I'm just highlighting a few of these orchard blocks. This is these orchards here on this property. This property is mostly they raise chicken and cattle. So the orchards are somewhat secondary to their main production here. You can see this big one right here. So the context in which these orchards are set is the really fascinating part of this project here, because the way the keyline system is set up is these roadways, right, that provide the access throughout the site. These roadways they're set up in a way relating to the contour that when water flows across this site in a large rain event, these roadways actually channel the water into these collection ponds. And then these collection ponds, they can be used for irrigation of the orchard. They're used to some degree just for landscape rehydration, right? So water is being channeled into this pond here, for example, and then this pond, the water is, you know, soaking into the ground. Some degree of the water is soaking subsurface, right? This isn't like a completely solidly lined pond. And then these trees that are downslope will benefit from that stored water, okay? So this is a real pattern in keyline, and you know, we talk about this in permaculture, where the access and the water flow are married in the same system, and then the vegetation is planted along these water lines and these access lines. So the maintenance of the trees is really easy. Getting around is easy, and the whole structure serves to collect water in here, right? So, you know, when we talk about in permaculture, we talk about the order of design. We talk about, you know, first we design for water, then we design for access, and then we design for vegetation, right? For permanent vegetation. So here you see that water access vegetation. You see that sequence perfectly in this design right here. You know, and how is this drought resilient? Well, just by the nature of placing the access, we're placing irrigation sources. And with all of these ponds placed across the landscape, and I'm only showing you a portion of this property, there is landscape rehydration going on throughout the landscape here. And even these roads they're only very slightly off contour. So there's a roadway with a very slightly off contour swale or ditch, which is itself absorbing a lot of water, and only the excess that isn't absorbed here is brought into this pond, right? So there's this innate drought resilience built into the way that things are arranged on this landscape. Okay, let's look at our next slide here. So here's another technique, and this was again popularized by the Keyline design system. And this is a farm in Wisconsin. This is the New Forest Farm. This guy, Mark Shepard, is a very well-known permaculture farmer, designer, practitioner. And he has very extensive orchards. I focused in on this one part of his system because this shows this interesting concept of orienting orchard rows that helps to conserve water in the soil. So here we have the drainage, right, on the left-hand side, and then we have another drainage on the right-hand side. So this is the valley where water flows. And then here in the center, we have the ridge. So this is a ridge here, the rounded ridge. Now these rows are oriented in a way that they are subtly sloping from the valley portion of this landscape. These rows are sloped towards the ridges. And so, as you all know, is when you have a row of fruit trees and then you have some sort of roadway in between, you know, there's a little bit of lift around the roots, the base of the fruit tree where the roots are, the fruit tree lifts a little bit. And then whenever you have a place where you're driving vehicles, there's a little bit of a sink, a little bit of compaction between the rows. So there's this very, very slight berm when we have this closely spaced row of trees. So it means that in a large rain event, when you have water that is moving across this landscape, right? When you have field capacity in the soil and you have rain and there's actually water moving through this landscape, that water will be very subtly drifted towards the ridge instead of being shunted into the valley. So this allows for more time, more surface area contact between the water and the soil. And so it actually, you know, it creates a greater hydration in what's typically the driest part of the landscape. So usually the ridge is the driest part of the landscape and the valleys are the wettest part of the landscape. But this row orientation pattern actually creates a more even distribution of water throughout the whole landform. And so it means that the soils stay more moist for longer, providing some measure of drought resilience. Okay, let's clear my drawings here and let's look at the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk about flood, and I'm just going to show you one slide on flood because this is just one of the most interesting and long-lasting examples in the world of building around very wet and flooded areas. So you see here, this is in Mexico, and this is in Mexico City, and these are the world-renowned chinampas, okay, also called the floating gardens of Xochimilco. So Mexico City was actually built on a giant lake. This entire city of 22 million people is on a lake, and because it was built on the site of the old Aztec Empire. The old Aztec Empire, they had their capital was built on an island, and they expanded out from that island by building these floating, you know, they started by building these rafts. And then these rafts were rooted in with trees, and then they would dig out these canals and pile the fertile muck onto these these rafts and these little islands, and then they planted trees. And eventually, over many years, they created this landscape where we have these raised areas, these little raised peninsulas and islands, and then we have these deeper channels for water. And so whenever they need to fertilize this area, they go and they just deepen these channels a little bit more, take out the muck and the algae and duckweed and all those things, and then they pile them here. They use it to fertilize their fields, and they're continually building up this area while sinking this area here. And it's created a situation where this area used to be too wet to put fruit trees or any kind of cultivation really. And now there are these raised dry islands, and if these trees get their roots deep enough, then they actually get their roots into this subsurface water table. So they're sub-irrigated. And an area that used to be a swamp or a lake is now an area that can be cultivated. So this is important when talking about climate resilience, because there's a lot of areas that are becoming wetter. Areas that are having more frequent intense rains, more flooding. I live in an area in Oregon here where we have seasonal flooding. There's lots of places that are flooded regularly every year. And so the idea of digging and making deeper channels and then making like small peninsulas and islands will create some resilience to waterlogging, which hopefully we can reclaim some land and also help some people who have orchards planted in places that used to be drier but now are wetter because of increasing rainfall, increasing intensity of storms. So, okay, let's move on here. So let's talk about wildfire for a minute. Now, where I live in Oregon, we've really seen some really crazy and dramatic increase in the intensity of fires. So this is a site here. It's a place called Cougar Mountain Farm. It's a place, and it's an area called Saginaw, which is just south of Eugene. So this is the Cascade, the foothills of the Cascade, so very dense forest. And this is a really, a place that it's at a high risk for wildfire at the point that we have fire moving through the Western Oregon Douglas fir forests. So these are all apples. This is an apple orchard here. And you can see this is a pretty steep slope here. This is kind of these little, they're not really built up terraces with stone, but they're somewhat terraces in the landscape sculpted in these clay soils. And you can see this pond here. And this pond right here is one of a series of ponds that is built throughout this landscape here. I couldn't show you them all because you wouldn't be able to see the orchard if I zoomed out. It's a very large property. And so first off, this pond is great for drought resilience, like we talked about, because this pond is setting here right above this orchard. So they can just gravity irrigate from this pond, and they can irrigate the orchard. They can irrigate the space in between the orchard very effectively without using any electricity, any energy. But the other thing about this particular pond is they built it big enough, literally, that a firefighting helicopter could land in it, right? And they also have it positioned where they have valves where they can open up and actually flood some of their more fire-prone areas from this pond in the event that a wildfire is moving up slope here. So the integration of pond and water collection systems like within the orchard landscape can really create some measure of resilience to wildfires. Okay, let's go to our next slide and tell me when I'm at the 5-minute mark too, please.
You are at the 5-minute mark.
I'm at the 5-minute mark. Okay. All right. Well, quick. We'll jump to Google Earth because this next one here, I can't show you on a flat screen. Okay. Can you see that Google Earth? All right. Okay.
Yes.
So this is Austria right here. And the reason I can't show you this site on a flat image is because it's such a big site and it is very sloped. And so we had to jump around a little bit for you to get a sense of this. This is a place called the Krematorhof. It's this very well-known permaculture farmer and designer Sepp Holzer. And you can see he's got these rows of trees, right? Many of these are orchard trees spread throughout this landscape. This is a steep slope in the Austrian Alps, so it gets very, very cold. But within this landscape of fruit trees and all sorts of production, you can see that there are ponds. These ponds are just tucked in all throughout on this south-facing slope. And what they do is they absorb this low sun in the wintertime and create this exceptional microclimate. So that the combination of the ponds throughout this landscape, as well as being planted on the steep slope, means that these warm microclimates are created, and also cold air is draining down, the coldest air is draining down to the valley bottom. So he's created a real resilient landscape to extreme cold events by microclimate development, as well as and water harvesting mixed in there. So for my last slide, I'm just going to talk about how placement is everything here. This is one of the most wonderful heirloom orchards I've ever been to. This is Capitol Reef National Monument. I'm sure some of the people that are watching this have been there. It's the remnants of the extensive Mormon orchards that were built all throughout the valley bottoms in this very dramatic landscape. And so I really like to go to visit this is actually what I did for my master's degree, was visiting old heirloom orchards that have just been sitting there, a lot of times untended for, 50, 80, 100 years, and looking at the ecological conditions, the context, the placement within the greater landscape to figure out, why is this location so good for orchard plants? I mean, here, obviously, we have the low area in the canyon, so you've got all the water draining down. That's where the soil is draining down as well. And then we've got these big rocky cliff faces for all of this radiant heat to come off of, creating this microclimate, that has proven successful for these orchards. So that would be my, my sort of advice to everybody is to go to old and even old abandoned orchards and look at the ecological and the landscape context. And that will give some clue about, some of the ways that we can design for climate resilience in our own systems. So that's my presentation, and thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Andrew. We appreciate that. And Andrew's PowerPoint, with the exception of the live Google Earth that we just saw, that's going to be made available to you guys as well. So we'll talk about that again later on. So with that, we're going to turn to our last panelist, Jacques Neukom. Jacques cooperates Neukom Family Farm, which is a certified organic farm that's 17 acres, and it's located in Humboldt County, California. He does this with his wife, Amy, and their children, Hazel and Eliza. The farm is 28 years old, and it includes a 10-acre dry farmed orchard of peaches, pluots, pears, apples, figs, and pomegranates. There's another 7 acres that they've dedicated to a wide variety of animal and perennial fruits and vegetables, and that includes an acre of wine grapes. They practice sustainable agriculture, dry farming, seed saving, and food preservation. Their food distribution is kept local. 100% of it is produced and sold within 45 miles of the farm. Jacques and Amy's primary goal is farming to lovingly feed and grow their community. So Jacques, as I understand, is just going to talk. There won't be a PowerPoint associated with this, but Jacques, we would love to hear from you.
Great. Thank you so much. I'll try and throw my hands around a lot, so it's active and exciting. But it was part of my problems today was how do you follow up Keith and Andrew, and to actually put slides in a slideshow prior to hearing them talk. I threw my hands up in the air and that was it. But so what I'd like to talk about today a bit is I'll start off with permaculture and then I'll end with dry farming. My situation is my home is kind of next door to the farm, And we're on 3 acres, and I've always studied permaculture. And a lot of permaculture is it can be really overwhelming. So one of the best things that anybody ever told me was just to watch your land, you know, understand what dries out first, understand where your shadows are in the summer and the winter. You know, I definitely had trees that I planted 4 different times, and they made it through the whole thing. As far as permaculture, there's no site that's ever a blank space. Maybe if it is a blank space, you shouldn't be there. You know, if it's a meadow, it's a meadow. It's not a blank space. Permaculture, you have to look. You know, a lot of what we see is edges. When you look at nature, the most fertile places are the edges. So a lot of the permaculture farms that you saw on those slides is making more edge, right? One of my goals with my 3-acre permaculture around my house is to learn. It's very educational. I try not to get attached to anything. If it's successful, then I kind of bring it out to the farm after that. You know, like I said, I didn't start with a blank piece of paper. There was a house here. There was some old trees. There was shade from the neighbors. There's slopes, different soil types. So as I started with what was already here and learned my soil, you know, some of the things that I learned was you can't do it all at once. Start small. And grow from your successes. Also, look at your neighbors. What is successful in your region? You know, you can push it. Now I'm to the point after 28 years where I'm planting things that not everybody else is. So I'm in a Mediterranean climate. It's really interesting because we're definitely a rainforest in the winter, but come April, we might not see rain at all until October. That's very typical. Also, our days are getting hotter. The heat is lasting longer. And then we're having more and more days that are 105 just continually. What used to happen around here is the fog would come in from the coast. I'm 20 miles as the crow flies from the coast. So the fog would always save us. We might get a day that was 105, and then the fog would come in that night, and it would only be 85 the next day. So how do I use permaculture around my house? Well, the farm takes a lot of energy. So a lot of times the last things you want to do when you farm all day is come home and garden. You know, weed the plants, you know, tend for that kind of thing. And in a way, what I've done is I filled every niche that there might be a weed. And then some things that were weeds, I've reclassified. They're not weeds anymore. Because I live in a Mediterranean climate, water is the biggest resource that we're lacking here. 3 acres doesn't mean I'm bordered by a stream or have a good, cheap, or free water supply. My entire farm is actually off of a 5/8 inch community water system. So I pay residential rates for my entire farm. What that means is I don't have a sprinkler on my entire farm. You know, I've adapted. My farm is heavily invested in mulch in one way or another. Around my house, it's a hard job to think about mulching 120 fruit trees, let alone shrubs and things. So what I've switched to is living mulch. So some things that go really well in my climate is like around the base of trees, I'll plant comfrey and yellow flag iris. This gives a habitat for frogs and toads. It gives nectar source for bees and hummingbirds and beneficial insects. And then also twice a year, I come in and cut it down and I mulch in place. It also keeps the grasses from encroaching too far in close to the trees and suffocating their root systems, having that mulch. So growing a mulch in place. Another thing that's unique, not to my place, but we're so far away from anything that the cost of transportation is huge. A lot of times I see, straw mulch is very typical, but mulch is what you make it. It can be, anything that's not toxic. We get a string. We grow 2 acres of tomatoes every year, and we use a sessile twine. We've looked hard and found sessile twine that isn't treated with kerosene, which most is if you buy it in the store, so that when we're done with it as trellising material, we can mulch with it. So, and it's a nice, long-lasting, high-carbon mulching source. But that said, mulch is hard to come by. So whether it's tree companies dropping wood chips or the living mulch, one thing is in permaculture is, things should have many uses. So something like a lamb's ear is a living mulch. It might not be edible, but the flour it provides is food for the beneficial insects, which is huge. Keep those. If something like a parasitic wasp has to leave your property in order to find a food source, it's probably not going to come back. So one little story about a plant that was a weed that is no longer a weed is in my climate around my house. I don't use water on my farm. I barely use water. But I try, if it's going to survive here, it has to be able to survive without added irrigation. So for the longest time, going into the summer, as it got hotter and drier, the iris would stop blooming, and the lavender would stop blooming, and the violets were long gone, and all these different things. If you get deeper and deeper into summer, there was less and less for the beneficial insects. And I was going around, trying to keep a garden that was so beautiful that my grandmother would appreciate it. And, if you can't get your neighbors to adopt your practices, where are we going on this earth? So I was trying to hold myself up to a really high standard of other people's beauty. So I was walking around and always constantly pulling chicory. And chicory is this tap-rooted weed that you don't have to water it. It just grows this woody, ugly, stumpy looking stalk. And I ended up hurting my back. As a farmer, that's like the worst thing you can do is hurt your back. But I ended up hurting my back pulling chicory. So at a certain point, the chicory just grew. And one morning, as I was walking around my overgrown garden, I noticed that nothing else was blooming but the chicory. And there was tons of it, and there was tons of beneficial insects. And that right there, I had always gone from looking at this plant as being so ugly and a weed. And then I realized that it had this deep taproot that was bringing nutrients up to the surface, and it didn't need water, and it was feeding my beneficial insects. And now it's one of my favorite plants. So a lot of permaculture can be in how you look at it, some of the talks today have been about animals and how do you integrate animals onto your farm. Well, an interesting thing about ours is that we're certified organic. I think it's definitely certified organic, but also it might be health code. A lot of times, you're not allowed to have animals close to a crop within 150 days or 120 days, depending on what it is of harvest. So even though we had a really beautiful system of running chickens in the orchard and ducks and things like that, we have really had to switch to more of a bring the food to them, which also works for us because we can give them a happy home, we can harvest their bedding, and that's the basis of our compost and fertility program. So you can run animals after fruit is harvested, so we like to do that. But the animals on a certified organic farm, that has been really tricky. It is nice when fruit branches drop, you bring it to the goats, concentrating that your effort, it's always nice to be able to just leave it where it drops. But as far as fertility, but our method of bringing it to specific places on the farm where the animals are, it's working for us at this point, and it's how we can stay certified. So as far as don't be scared. Like, permaculture has got so many things. One of the neat aspects of it is that you'll constantly be learning. The mastery, there's people out there that would love to help you. Consultants, friends, groups, there's lots of people out there willing to help you, but really get started. I know for my climate, getting started, I really like to establish my long-term planting, so my fruit trees. I also find in my climate, I'm using almost exclusively standard rootstock. So going for larger trees, the few places I have done like a dwarfing apple rootstock might be on my very small, on the edge of my very small home lawn for the family and the kids. Like, it's the only place that I keep green like that, and right on its edge, it's surrounded by an espalier apple fence. Now, talking about mulch, like wood chip mulch, straw mulch, and living mulch, to segue into dry farming, permaculture, orchards in a changing climate, right? Around here, we used to be able to grow our tomatoes without shade cloth. Now, all of my tomatoes, I use 30% shade cloth so they don't sunburn. We've seen this coming for a long time. It's already happening. By planting and dry farming, what you're basically doing is you're breaking the capillary action of the soil column so that the moisture in the ground stays in the ground, instead of that top molecule of water evaporating, bringing the next molecule of water evaporating, and also the vegetation on the ground that's competing with your trees evaporating or transpiring your moisture. What we do with our 10-acre orchard is we grow a cover crop for the winter, providing nitrogen and organic matter, and then we cultivate it under so that we do a dust mulch. Because when you're talking about something in a Mediterranean climate like mulch, the thought of importing that much mulch it's not real. This farm does 100% of its income is the farm. So dry farming allows us many things. It labor wise and diesel fuel wise, I'm not mowing. I'm going through it once in the springtime to take down my cover crop and establish this dust mulch. I'm going through it once in the fall to put in my cover crop. So very little labor on that aspect. Also disease pressure. A lot of what I grow, stone fruit, highly susceptible to diseases. By creating a dust mulch, you're taking your humidity in your orchard way down, which is where a lot of fungal issues come from. So disease pressure is much less in a dry farmed orchard. Also water, around here, we have salmon in the river, all year long. You might come to this place and think how water rich we are, but really anywhere, in California is, water is precious, and the more that can stay in the river, the better. So, the fact that I have a 10-acre orchard and I don't even have, I have no way to irrigate it. I don't even have a water line there. It's not necessary. Starting with a standard rootstock, I really love Lavelle for the stone fruit, but a standard rootstock is a vigorous rootstock. A standard rootstock, something that's tap rooted, is going to go down and find that water. The way I look at it is every year I prune my fruit tree, and I don't prune its roots. So I'm trying to keep the aerial portion of the tree smaller than the root of the tree. There is like an innate wisdom in every plant. They know when to stop growing. They know when it's a good year to fruit or not to fruit. If you can keep them healthy, you're going to have a good crop of fruit. By pruning, in the winter, you're keeping all those nutrients and all that energy in the ground. That burst of life in the springtime, the tree's judging its health, and it's got more than enough energy. So annual crops of apples, cherries, peaches, plums, pluots. It's like healthy trees. Also, what I'm doing is I'm getting that tree from a very young age. I'm telling it to put its roots down. So when we do get a heat wave, my neighbors who irrigate their trees, their roots are trained to the surface, and you can see it. You can see the leaves showing signs of drought stress, turning yellow, falling off, sunburn on the bark. When my trees get that heat, they're fine. Their roots are down in 55-degree, fertile, moist soil. People sometimes talk about quantity, tons per acre. My first and foremost for me is quality. I'm not competing against an industrial agricultural system because you'll lose. I get more than enough fruit off my trees. And I also, size is as big as anybody else's. Sugar content is through the roof. The dry farming kind of lets, I like to tell people, like, if you water an apple tree, it might set the harvest date back a little, but eventually it's going to get up to sugar. With something like a peach or a pluot, you're going to get a bigger fruit because that's the idea of watering, but it's not going to get any sweeter. You end up getting, you end up getting customers that go try somebody else's. Our line speaks for us at the farmers market. It's a pretty beautiful thing to see.
Jacques, we're just about out of speaking time.
Okay.
So, any final thoughts you want to have?
No, I'll just wait for questions. That'd be fine.
Okay, great. Thank you. That was really interesting and very cool.
Yeah.
I'm going to start my video back up. Thank you, Leslie, for that reminder. All right. So I know some of the questions have been answered. Keith has answered some directly. And Chris has been, the other Chris has been monitoring questions. So Chris, is there any that you see that you want to throw out to?
Yeah, I just want to say that I don't know if people can see some of the answered questions that Keith answered during his session. But Christine Small asked, recommend any beginning reading material on methods presented here. And he mentioned some websites that hopefully, Keith, you can add afterward to the documents that are going up online for everyone. And Lauren asks to Keith, how often do you do a soil test to make sure fertilizer levels are appropriate? I understand that chicken fertilizer is particularly harsh. And Keith says chicken manures are high in nitrogen, used with caution or lightly. Annual tests are generally sufficient. I use rock-based minerals in my garden for the last 45 years. And then Stephen asks, this is, I think, the last one of the answer questions. Stephen asks, any type of mulberry that's specifically used for fodder? And Keith says, I use the most common species. There are several to select from. I've seen a South American variety with huge leaves. You can see an overview from our sponsor, One Green World, apparently. And then Lauren asks about diseases transmitting from one plant to another when they're in close proximity. And Keith says, I grow healthy plants in a healthy soil. Healthy soil is a primary part of the plant's immune system. Foliar feeding, proper pruning are two of the many things that support healthy conditions. If after that they get diseased, they might just need to be removed. And that seems pretty straightforward. And then there are a number of other great questions. Some people basically, feeling inspired, feeling that the content was very informative. Here's one that from Ellen Layton, I believe. Excuse me if I pronounce your name wrong. And this was for I'm not sure exactly, but it says where was the heirloom orchard slide shown, or where was the heirloom orchard shown on the slide? I think that might have been for Andrew.
I think that was Andrew.
Yeah, that was Capitol Reef National Monument in southern Utah, which is like, it's a national park, but there's the whole canyon bottom of this very dramatic landscape is filled with old heirloom orchards that were planted in the 1800s, basically, when the whole area was a homestead. So, interestingly, when the Mormons settled Utah, they had a incredibly fast-paced breeding program where they planted seeds of all the major fruit crops that you can grow. You can grow apricots and peaches there, and apples and pears and plums and other things. And they planted them, and then they had a special envoy who basically went around and collected within like 12 years or so from planting, collected all of the best varietals that had shown themselves from seed, and then redistributed those, created nurseries and redistributed those. So it was a really the colonization of that area, preceded a very rapid fruit tree breeding program. So when you go and find these old orchards, places like Capitol Reef National Monument, you find there's like really spectacular and interesting varieties that are specifically adapted to the high desert. Like I'll just tell one more thing, then I'll stop. They call it the Mormon apricot. And it's an apricot that it blooms the same time as normal apricots, but it has really, really thick tissue in the blossoms that are frost resistant. So it fruits at like 6,000 feet in the high desert in northern Arizona, southern Utah.
So one of the things this has come up in the questions, and I think there's probably a lot of people out there for whom permaculture is new. And many of them are maybe living in urban areas or small, maybe they just have a small yard. And so I think I'm going to direct this to Keith first, because I know that he has done this. Someone with a small amount of space, maybe just a yard, maybe not much of a budget, Where do they begin? How do they start?
My partner Peter Bain's book on this. Can you hear me? Okay. His book, the Permaculture Handbook, is actually addressed to people with small to medium properties, and it's a great introduction. I did provide some links there in the Q&A for folks who want to.
And we'll add that. We'll add that into the Google Drive as well. There's great pictures in that book as well. As I recall, you guys have really documented with pictures from start to finish.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There's several here about weeds. And Mark Peters says, great lesson learned about a chicory. I think you said chickweed, Jacques, but on your farm.
It was chicory. Chicory.
Oh, it was chicory. Okay. And then Lauren says, it was my understanding that weeds are terrible for berry bushes. If I understand that correctly, how far away from berry bushes do you allow weeds to grow to avoid having to weed like crazy after the weeds go to seed? And Chris, maybe that's one for everybody. Is what are weeds really? You know?
Yeah. Maybe Jacques, you want to go ahead and.
Yeah, I would just say, like with growing raspberries or something like that, like, you know, some certain things aren't weeds. You know, if I got a rhizomatous grass in my raspberries, I would try and get it out, you know, or I would try and mulch it aggressively and smother it. Some things are a lot more tolerant of weeds. You know, growing a comfrey plant or two around the base of a small shrub might be all you need to keep, you know, soil, you know, healthy and the plant good. In some places, that might be the perfect place for a mouse or a rat to come chew the base of the tree. So it's really, you know, site by site, knowing your land, you know, knowing your crop. But, you know, if you don't know it yet, you know, just watch the color of the leaves, watch the growth, and you'll learn a lot about, you know, what is a weed. So, you know, on a farm, it's financial, you know, so it might not look pretty, but I'm not throwing weddings on my farm. I am growing food. So at times there's times of the year that I don't like giving tours because there's some weeds out there. But you know, a few weeds is, you know, once you start understanding what your weeds are, that's the big one.
Yeah. So
I would add, I could add to that too, because I'm a big fan of weeds. In my soils, I need every bit of carbon I can get. I have a pernicious so-called weed here that everybody curses because it has this deep tap root. It makes lots and lots of seeds. It's related to what is it? Russian knapweed is what it's called, and it loves sand, and it makes deep roots. And I'm going, deep roots. That's exactly what I'm looking for. So, my weeds are, like Jacques said, nasty grasses. Grasses are ones that I want. I'm thrilled with broadleaf weeds. Yes. The more the merrier, because I use them for fodder, for feed, for the animals, to make fertilizer teas out of weeds. And the healthier and happier my weeds are, the better it is. Now, yes, there are limits, and I do suppress them, and that's where the animals work, and so do tools. Yeah.
So one of the themes that is running through every one of your presentations, and for those who are new to this concept of permaculture, I think this is something that we should perhaps drive home again, is the look, see, watch, and really understand what's going on your land. Would you guys all agree?
Yeah.
Learning, and one of the things I came away, with early on in permaculture is water. Water's a big thing. Knowing your water. Would you guys want to comment on that any further?
Andrew produced a very lovely video now on YouTube all about managing water in the landscape. Our colleague who wrote the book on water harvesting, Andrew, could you recall his name?
Oh, Brad Lancaster?
Brad Lancaster, yeah, highly recommended. And yeah.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, so there are several more here. One was a specific question for Jacques, and actually two, and I'm just going to put them together and allow you to answer them. They were, one was about where do you get the non-toxic twine that is kerosene-free? And then the second, that's from Pat Holland. And the second one is from Peter Beans, and is how is the summer dust mulch not subjected to wind-blown erosion and topsoil loss?
Yep. Okay. Both great questions. As far as the twine, the sessile twine, it's sold in packs of 10, and it's the exact same company that does the normal stuff. It's called like Mex Chem, right? It's from Mexico, and it's produced by a chemical company, but this stuff is not like dipped in kerosene. So, and then we get it at Central Valley Ag Supply, and it is online. Central Valley Ag Supply is online. It's a large warehouse that caters to farmers. But I mean, I have to drive 4 hours to pick it up every year, but it's going towards the San Francisco Bay Area. I figure once a year I go to San Francisco once a year. So I pack my car with this twine. It's pretty funny. So yeah, so that's number one. What was the second question? It was, the dust mulch. Yeah, very
dust
easy.
Mulches,
yeah. So the dust mulch, you have to know your soil. So my soil, there's a moment it's too wet, and then there's a moment it's too dry. So when it's just right, after, what I try and do is I try and hit it after that last rain of the springtime, and I hit it when it's got some moisture, and basically like if you've been to the desert Southwest, there's this biofilm or like a crust that's on even desert soils, and when you break that crust, it's dusty and it blows away. If I do my cultivation at the right time, I get the top, the moisture is enough to put a crust on the top, and it doesn't blow away. And all my new employees, I tell them to watch the gravel road that goes beside the farm, because the gravel road puts off way more dust than the orchard ever does. And even though we harvest from every single one of those trees, it's not dusty at all. Actually, the things that's the most dusty is when dogs get out there and start playing with each other. That makes dust. But really, like that dust mulch has this crust from when that residual moisture dries out from the top down. And you can go out there, I'm doing this in April, and you can go out there in September and dig down just 4 or 6 inches, and you'll see the color of the soil change, and that's moisture, So yeah, I think also we've put a hedgerow around the entire farm. And so that helps. And then the fact that we're talking trees here. So that any sort of wind that comes through, we also, like, if we got a 15-mile-an-hour wind where I am, that would be like shocking. It's not a very windy place.
Great. So one more question. Is there one, Chris, that you would like to?
Yeah, there are a lot more, but this is one from myself that I think would be good for people to know. Andrew, I've always been very impressed by your YouTube content. It's very informative and illustrative. And I'm not sure everyone knows that you have a YouTube channel and what it's about. And I think, speaking of really good resources, it's a really good resource. And I was wondering if you could spend a minute to talk about that.
Yeah, sure. So I have a channel. It's kind of a combination between permaculture travel videos where I go to different places and look at like really extraordinary and large scale projects. So I have a series. I spent a lot of time over in India, and I have if you want to know about water, I did a series, a seven video series called India's Water Revolution, where we toured some of, I call one of them is I'm calling the largest permaculture project on Earth, but these really big scale projects that are restoring whole watersheds and water tables from a whole region. So that's some of the stuff I do, and then I also because I work at Oregon State University, I have access to like a lot of their, you might say, gizmos and gadgets, right? So they have this light board where you kind of draw on the glass and then they flip the image so it looks like I'm just kind of writing on the air. And I'm an illustrator, so I do a lot of like diagrammatic kind of illustrations of rainwater harvesting systems. And I just did one about wildfire defense, which we touched on in the presentation. And I did a whole one on ponds and on like water recycling. So I kind of pick, mostly water is really my main interest. So a lot of things focus around water. But you can find that just my name, Andrew Millison. If you just go on YouTube, you'll find the channel there. And I'm going to continue. I have a lot of stuff in the works too. So we're putting out a lot of stuff right now. So, keeping it fresh.
Great. Yeah. Thank you. So I just want to, again, thank all of our panelists here, Keith, Andrew, and Jacques, for volunteering their time to come and speak to us today, for answering the questions, for providing resources. Again, this is recorded, so it's going to be available to everybody who's registered for the conference and all of the NAFEX members. Videos are typically available 24 hours after the session, but just if you don't see it right away, hang tight, it'll show up. The resources will be made available. And for those of you who are new, make sure that you log into the website with your email address and start checking out all of the resources we have available there. And again, a plug for all of our other sessions that are coming up. We still have a lot more to come. Tonight will be on peaches. Tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, we're going to do sort of the history of NAFEX and kind of talk about all the things we have available, both current and historical. And we'll have a short business meeting that I encourage everyone to attend. And then we'll have another session tomorrow evening. So thank you guys again for this wonderful conversation, for all of your knowledge, sharing what you know. And, please, for those of you watching, please, thank these guys if you have a chance, visit their websites, their YouTube channels, and just, learn and soak in everything that they have to offer. So thank you all, and thank all of you for attending. And we will see many of you tonight for the peaches and again tomorrow. So you guys have a great afternoon. We will see you later. Bye.